Lithuania, still in the process of re-establishment, ended up as part of the Europe created by the Peace Treaty of Versailles of 1919. Lithuanians wanted to become equal members of the modern world, to nurture a united public society, to raise the country's prestige on the international scale, and to make the country's name famous. From the very first days of statehood, politicians and diplomats had no doubt that culture was the most suitable method of introducing Lithuania, which was barely known to anybody, to the world. For this reason, the state became the most reliable patron of the arts. In 1933, President Antanas Smetona proclaimed, quote, "Arts and sciences must have practical applications, they must serve the nation, provide it with help wherever it needs it, and they must also help politics honestly and transparently." End quote. In this way, the concept of utilitarian art was being formed. Practicality and ideological topicality were important criteria for creativity. The application of arts for promotional purposes and propaganda also motivated society's interest in art and raised the prestige of the artist. An official art policy was forming, which also created an official style. The image of the state was embodied in pieces of art using certain methods of depiction. Inspired by the national ideological vision, streets and buildings in Lithuanian cities and towns were decorated on public holidays not only with national flags, ribbons or multicolored lights, but also with images of state leaders and heroes from the past. A type of movable monument was invented. For example, in 1930, while commemorating the 500th anniversary of the death of Vytautas the Great, a plan was hatched to travel around Lithuania with a picture of this former ruler. A bronze cast of Vytautas the Great on a commemorative medal created by Petras Rimša was put into a wooden frame, and it was made into a processional picture. A true fervor for monuments overtook the country when commemorating Independence Days. In the squares and cemeteries of the interim capital, county centers, towns and parishes, and in places of famous battles and at the tops of castle hills, over 200 obelisks, crosses, stelae, statues, and busts made of granite and concrete, reminding people of the country's prominent figures in culture and politics, were put up. Representation, complicated multi-figure composition, and symbolic architectural forms, pyramids and obelisks with many symbols, signs and inscriptions, were valued. The works of Antanas Aleksandravičius and Vincas Grybas embodied the ideal of monuments. Monuments nurtured the feelings of patriotic pride and national belonging, and also encouraged artists to pay more attention to other areas of art. Pieces of art of the historic genre met the requirements of national distinction on their own. However, it was not easy for Lithuanians to designate their own essence and to describe their national identity. What is a national tradition and where do you look for it? This question became a harrowing puzzle for Kaunas's intellectuals and artists. Even great powers became concerned with the search for roots. The idea of national style that was popular in the 19th century was revived. Italians looked for Italianness in the Renaissance period, and the French looked for Frenchness, and Germans looked for Germanness in Gothic times. In Lithuania it was believed that of all the country's artistic heritage, only folk art could interest and surprise foreign spectators. The source of authentic nationality was seen namely in the traditional folk art. During the entire 2 decades of independence, attention to folk art did not decrease. It was thought of with particular respect. The question of Lithuanian style was publicly discussed as early as 1915, during the Lithuanian Art Association's general meeting in Vilnius. A suggestion to combine convenience with folk motifs in public and sacramental buildings was made. Mikalojus Konstantinas Čiurlionis claimed that, quote, "folk art should be the foundation of our art and a unique Lithuanian style should emerge from it," end quote. In the early 20s, a broad cultural movement, collection and examination of monuments of peasant art, in which all of the intellectuals, from provincial teachers to well-known artists were involved, began. There were some firm attitudes about the role of folk art in the formation of a national style. Artists of the older generation, such as Ignas Šlapelis and Kazys Šimonis, claimed that if a professional artist wants to use folk art, he should adapt rough folk forms to the principles of high aesthetics, that is, improve, beautify and stylize them. The artistically interpreted and stylized ornamentation of country textile patterns, wood carvings and chests of drawers was applied in the everyday environment, from the designs of cigarette and soap packages, posters, book illustrations and the formatting of periodicals to the embellishment of institutions, club halls and railway stations. Starting with the mid-20s, the opinion started to prevail that it is not the style of ornamentation, but rather the usage of the main principles of folk creativity that should inspire the attempts of modern artists. In the forthrightness and authenticity of the expression of folk art, an advantage over academy creations was perceived. Young artists heartily studied forms of folk art and primarily forms of sculpture and wooden cult figures. They learned from them how to reveal the power of initial emotion with somewhat rough and economical artistic methods. International recognition encouraged the comparison of folk art with high art. The exhibitions of Lithuanian folk art organized abroad won recognition. In Paris in 1935 and 1937, in New York in 1939, in Monza, Italy in 1925, and in the Scandinavian countries in 1931. Using the official style, the objective was to show Lithuania as a prosperous agricultural country that was becoming an industrial and trade state. When creating such an image, romantic idealization was not avoided. Landscape motifs and characters, as well as their clothing, such as stylized national dress, conveyed the nationalistic spirit in the works of art in genres other than the historical genre. The main characters representing Lithuania were idealized country personalities. Ploughmen, seeders, rake-wielders, flaxen-haired young women, and white-headed mothers, who were often integrated into the setting of a country landscape or a peasant's house. A grey-headed person playing the kanklis, the Lithuanian string musical instrument, and rūpintojėlis, the worrying Christ, symbolized the nation's suffering, oppression, and awakening. In the 30s, polemic articles appeared in the magazine Naujoji Romuva, in which the questions of Lithuanian distinctiveness, of the style of Lithuanian architecture and art, and of continuation of national traditions were discussed. However, in Lithuania there were only a few examples of national architecture in which motifs of folk architecture were used forthrightly. The most famous work of this type is the interior of the Karininkų Ramovė in Kaunas. Building designers, who grew to like the principles of cosmopolitan rationalism, tried to include the features of the national style into the architecture. In separate forms of interior furnishing, they imitated the inheritance of the work of villagers, so that the country textile patterns were used for terrazzo floor patterns, motifs of decorated aprons were applied to traceries of partition walls, and the forms of furniture reminded people of the tables and chairs of people from the country. The creators of decoration for public buildings tried to combine two goals: to propagate the idea of statehood and to symbolically convey the building's function. For example, in the interiors of banks and in the different premises of the Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Crafts, the image of Lithuanian economic prosperity was created, and in the decorations of Karininkų Ramovė and the Metropolis Hotel in Kaunas, the theme of the state's grand past dominated. In artistic portrayal of everyday lives, the most important role was given to women. They were given the task of nurturing traditional crafts. The magazine Moteris, Woman, published in 1921, wrote, quote, "Female Lithuanian intellectuals should accept this beautiful task to revive the pretty handcraft of our mothers in Lithuania. Women of nobility wore national costumes rather than the afternoon dresses of Western fashion for special occasions. Objects of folk art, either made by hostesses themselves or at least tactfully chosen, were spread throughout the interiors of homes."